1970s was a decade full of new music and fads. Also, new idols arose during this time that are still famous today. To start off, during the 70s, the term rock and roll had nearly become meaningless after the Beatles broke up and Elvis Presley died. The new music fad was disco. This brought about certain fashion trends, new idols, and also a new attitude. The new fashion during this decade was typically bell-bottom jeans, pantsuits, and Farrah Fawcett hair. John Travolta was one of those idols. He starred in the popular movies at the time, which included Grease and Saturday Night Fever. Other famous movies and television shows that were from the 70s were Star Wars, The Brady Bunch, Saturday Night Live, and Sesame Street. Another idol at the time was swimmer Mark Spitz, who won 7 gold medals at the 1972 Olympics. As far as new technology, Microsoft was founded in 1975 by Bill Gates. Lastly, a development of the 70s that is very popular today was the invention of the email in 1971. The 1970s was a decade that was not just known for disco and bell-bottom jeans. Many events tested the United States after finishing the longest war in American history. That was the 1970s. But let's start from the beginning. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970. This soon led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and also many acts including the Clean Air Act and the Water Quality Improvement Act. Many Americans at the time were very worried about the environment. This influenced the acts of future presidents in the decade. Earth Day also helped lead to nuclear power instead of the use of coal and oil. During this decade, the Vietnam War was still going on. At Kent State University, 4 students were killed in a protest against the war. Many Americans grew angry at their government. Some of the anger was towards the fact that many young men in the war were drafted and couldn't even vote. The Senate then approved the 26th Constitutional Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. Over time, through a process called Vietnamization, Nixon gradually pulled out troops. In 1973, a 4-part Vietnam peace pact, the Paris Peace Accords, were signed in Paris, France. The last U.S. military troops left the war zone on March 29th that year. Once the war ended, America dug into a recession. Since the war was over, a phenomenon called stagflation occurred, which was an economic condition in which inflation is accompanied by unemployment. Also during this time, Nixon makes a visit to Moscow to discuss a strategic arms pact called Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. This limited the number of intercontinental nuclear missiles each nation could have. This was a small first step in reducing nuclear threat. Therefore, the U.S. and Soviet Union entered into a period called détente, which was the lessening of military and diplomatic tensions between countries. The 1970s was also known for the big event called Watergate. It all started because President Nixon was paranoid he wouldn't get reelected. He then hired creepers to investigate the Democratic Party and ruin their reputations. These 5 men were caught carrying wiretap equipment and other spying devices into the office of the Democratic National Committee. It was later discovered that these men had ties to the White House and were being paid with funds from Nixon's campaign organization. Many grew suspicious that President Nixon knew. Investigators asked Nixon to release the tapes from the Oval Office, but Nixon refused. Before he could reach impeachment, Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford took presidency. Ford granted Nixon full pardon, and this whole scandal was known as the Watergate Affair. Another event sparked attention in American eyes. This was known as the Arab oil embargo. In 1960, Arab countries and other oil exporting countries formed the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. When the Arab-Israel War started in 1973, OPEC quadrupled oil prices. During this war, the Arabs were easily angered that the U.S. sided with Israel. Their anger was taken out by cutting off oil shipments in the U.S., more familiarly known as the energy crisis. Along with the beginning celebrating Earth Day, this event also led to the switch of nuclear power. In 1976, Jimmy Carter beat Gerald Ford in a closely contested election. One of Carter's first tasks was to stimulate the economy. The Carter administration's policies helped reduce unemployment, but they also powered inflation. Carter's anti-inflation program produced even more unemployment. Once again, the economy was stuck in a recession. A major cause of the economy's distresses was the high cost of imported oil. Congress then created the Department of Energy to reduce the nation's oil dependence. But in 1979, OPEC raised the price of oil to 50%, leading to another U.S. energy crisis. In 1978, Carter pushed for the passage of the Panama Canal Treaties, which granted Panama control over canal operations back to Panama. Carter not only thought this was the right thing to do, but he also hoped that this approach would improve America's image and lessen the appeal of communism. In domestic affairs, this decade ended with the Iran hostage crisis. In the 1950s, the U.S. helped overthrow Iran's leader and restore Shah Reza Pahlavi to power. However, followers of the militant Islamic leader forced the Shah to flee the country. Iran's new government was outraged when President Carter allowed the Shah in the U.S. for medical treatment. Therefore, in an effort to force the Shah to return to Iran, Iranian militants seized 53 American hostages in Tehran. In 1980, a rescue mission failed, killed 18 Americans. Frustration with the President Carter grew on Americans, which led to the election of Ronald Reagan. The hostages were later released in 1981. Many events made the 1970s very important in American history.